Okay, hello folks. Welcome to another session of PHI 331. I hope everybody's doing well in light of these weird circumstances of social distancing. So, today we're going to be looking at a somewhat new topic as a subsection of our topic of inequality and property rights. So for the next 2 weeks, we're going to be looking at and thinking about questions related to historical injustice and reparations. And in particular, this week we're going to be thinking about reparations for Indigenous persons. And next week we're going to be thinking about the question of reparations for African Americans in the United States. So without any further ado, let's get to today's topic. The essay is Reparations to Native Americans by the philosopher J. Angelo Corlett. So this has been a topic of conversation in the practical realm, and it's certainly an important topic as related to the history of the United States. So just this first image here is of Bigfoot, who was one of the leaders of the Lakota Sioux Nation. And there he is laying in the snow at the Wounded Knee Massacre, where he was killed. This was in 1890. So this is just to bring to light how long-standing these issues of injustice towards Indigenous people or Native Americans has been. Just a quick remark, Native Americans is the terminology that Corlett uses. So I'm going to follow his terminology here. Although, if you think that we should be using a term such as Indigenous persons, please let me know in the comments or in the discussion boards on the course website. Because certainly we want to use the most respectful language that we can whenever possible. But here's the plan for today. So we're going to look at some facts about injustices towards Native Americans. We're going to consider Corlett's argument in favor of reparations. And then we're going to consider objections to Corlett's theory, his argument in favor of reparations, and consider the replies that he develops. I'm not going to do a slide on biographical information, but what you can know is Corlett is a contemporary philosopher working in philosophy today. He teaches at San Diego State, and he's written about a number of topics. Everything from punishment to reparations, as we see here, but also questions about things like atheism and agnosticism. But enough about that sort of biographical information. Let's get going. So, historical considerations. One thing I'll say from the get-go is I don't think that it's a view that's worth taking seriously, the view that injustices have not been done to Native Americans. Basically, you'd have to be blind to the facts, or rather deluded, to think that Native Americans have been treated justly throughout history. So that's just the first point we ought to highlight and dwell on, is that grave injustices have been committed against Native Americans in terms of seizures of land, unjustified violence, so things like the Wounded Knee Massacre, and also cultural imperialism. So cultural imperialism is just the idea of crushing the culture of other individuals. But if you want to learn more about the facts involved with unjustified violence, go ahead and have a look at the Wikipedia page about the Wounded Knee massacre. And if you want to learn more about cultural imperialism, you might want to look at and consider the Wikipedia page about American Indian boarding schools. You might remember that I'm a Canadian citizen, so the Wikipedia page about the Canadian residential school system, they call them residential schools in Canada, gives you a sense of the extreme injustice that was done to Native American people in terms of forcing them to not practice their culture, basically sending young Indigenous children away to boarding schools to try to force them to not practice Native American culture anymore. So this meant beating them for speaking their own language and forcing them to study and practice Christianity. So yeah, these Wikipedia pages are a good start. If you want to start to familiarize yourself with some of the specifics of the grave injustices that have been committed against Native Americans. For further reading, I just recommend one book. This is by an Indigenous Canadian author named Thomas King, and it's called The Inconvenient Indian, A Curious Account of Native People in North America. So, the Wounded Knee Massacre and the story of the American Indian boarding school system, as well as the Canadian residential school system. These things just scratch the surface of the extent to which Indigenous people in North America have been the victims of grave injustices. And as far as I'm concerned, and I will proceed on the assumption that we can't really take seriously the denial of this claim, which seems evident to me, that Native Americans have been subject to grave injustices. So, with that in mind, let's look at Corlett's central argument about reparations for Native Americans. So first he tells us that clear historic rights violations ought to be rectified as much as humanly possible by reparations. So when there are historic violations of rights, we ought to do something about them. 2, the U.S. government has committed clear historic rights violations against Native Americans. So, therefore, the U.S. government morally ought to pay reparation to Native Americans, and, as he puts it, as much as humanly possible. So as much as we could feasibly do to pay back Native Americans who have been victims of grave injustices, we've got to do that. So this is a valid argument. I guess the question will be whether it's sound. Now, I've already said that it seems pretty clear that the U.S. government has committed clear rights violations against Native Americans. Seizures of land, unjustified violence, and cultural imperialism. And just remember, this argument is not coming out of nowhere. A couple of weeks ago, we looked at Robert Nozick, and Nozick told us that if past injustice has shaped present holdings in various ways, some identifiable and some now, what now, if anything, ought to be done to rectify these injustices? Well, Nozick doesn't spell it out as clearly as he might. And one thing I don't love about Robert Nozick's writing, as insightful a philosopher as he is, even when you disagree with him, he does write with a lot of rhetorical questions. If you go back to Anarchy, State, and Utopia and start counting the rhetorical questions, you start to wonder, whether Nozick's actually going to state his view. When I went back to find his principle of reparation, this is about as close as I got. But what he's implying here is clear enough. It's that when past injustices has shaped present holdings, remember, holdings are just the amount of money, material goods that an individual has. So insofar as past injustices have shaped present holdings, it seems that part of a theory of just holdings is going to rectify these unjustly gotten holdings. So that's Corlett's main argument. It's the idea that insofar as injustices have been committed, and they have been, we're going to need to pay reparation. So here's the first objection that might be raised against Corlett's argument that he addresses. It's the thought that there's historical complexity in play. So it says that the historical details of the injustice against Native Americans are too complex to serve as the basis of determinate reparations claims. So the thought might be, we do not know what predicament Native Americans would be in if cultural imperialism, if a systematic, grave series of injustices had been committed against Native Americans. So we just don't know enough about what things would be like if these injustices had not been committed. But Corlett responds, we don't actually need to know all the details about who exactly was harmed in exactly what ways. In fact, in one of the more interesting claims in the paper, he says that even if Native Americans were extremely well off, even if they were more well off than average citizens, they would still be owed reparation for the injustices done to them in the past. Further prosperity doesn't change the fact that injustices were done to them and that they are owed reparations. But Corlett also points out there is plenty we do know about the harms and injustices done to Native Americans. So Corlett is going to say, we do know that the lands now inhabited by most Americans or owned by the federal government were, for the most part, stolen from Native Americans. And unless you raise a bunch of really far-fetched, skeptical questions about this, this is something that Corlett thinks that we can know. So that's enough to justify reparations. We know enough about what was done in the past for it to be completely reasonable to think that injustices were done and that reparation is owed. So just thinking about Nozick again, Corlett appeals to a principle that he calls the principle of morally just acquisitions and transfers. So he says that whatever is acquired or transferred by morally unjust means is itself morally unjust. So the thought here is that it's morally unjust to acquire lands that were themselves acquired or transferred by unjust means. So the thought is, if America's lands were originally acquired through theft and fraud, then they can never be owned justly ever again. So we might think of this principle as sort of like an infection principle. It's the thought that if its origin is unjust, say the ownership in a certain parcel of land, and maybe it's made unjust by its theft from Native Americans, then no number of legitimate transfers could make a holding in that land just. So here's another objection. It's the objection to collective responsibility. So the thought here is that I didn't commit these injustices against Native Americans. That was people over 100 years ago, for instance, who committed the massacre at Wounded Knee. So it's wrong to hold the current government and its citizens morally responsible for the wrongs of previous generations. Well, Corlett responds here that because the governing documents of the United States have stayed largely the same, the U.S. government has persisted. So it's one entity that has not gone out of existence. We might think about how organizations can continue to exist even after all of their citizens are replaced. Well, you might think it could be a similar thing to, say, a basketball team, right? Even though none of the members of the 1992 Chicago Bulls still play for the Chicago Bulls, because it's been a persistent organization, and I don't know the facts of the matter here, but maybe it's had the same ownership or it's been run on the same principles, this organization still exists. So just like you can replace all the members of a basketball team and it can still be the same basketball team, well, the US government still has the same organizing documents, and even though we've replaced all the citizens since 115 years ago, we do want to say, well, we do inherit the advantages that we acquired through prior inhabitants of our organization committing injustices. So there is an inheritance of advantages, just like you can inherit as a country debts acquired, when different citizens populated the country. And once we think that, well, yeah, the U.S. government is an entity that exists now and has existed since the founding of the country, or since the signing of the Constitution, it still exists, he further asks, why should we think there is a statute of limitations on justice? So, the statute of limitations is just the thought that in the legal system, there are some cases where a person cannot be charged for a crime a certain number of years after the crime is committed. So, for instance, you cannot be arrested and convicted, I believe, for something like an assault that happened 20 years ago. But that's for legal and practical reasons. When it comes to the question of justice and injustice, it's quite another question, Corlett thinks. There shouldn't be a statute of limitations on justice itself. Here's another objection to reparations from Native Americans. It's that making reparations to Native Americans would decrease overall social utility. One way that Corlett puts it is, if we pay back ownership and management of all the land unjustly acquired from Native Americans, that would basically mean the end of the United States of America as we know it. Or it would just be extremely costly. We wouldn't be able to build new schools or build new roads or fund our military, any number of these things. How do we respond to this? Well, Corlett says that may well be true, but in this circumstance, when we start thinking about just transfers and acquisitions, we realize that even if paying reparations is going to hurt, that's what justice requires us to do. So even if it does hurt, it doesn't change the fact that all things considered, that may well be our moral requirement. So that's the way that Angelo Corlett is thinking about it. Now, he does point out there may be ways of making reparations that don't decrease the social utility. So one version of that he considers is the so-called Buffalo Commons. So it's basically saying that this would give back American land to Native Americans for them to form their own separate nation in a way that doesn't disrupt the US economy. So a big part of this would be giving away a large stretch of land sort of in the middle of the country, sort of stretching from the Rocky Mountains east all the way up to Montana and all the way down to Mexico. So basically this large stretch of unpopulated land in the Great Basin. Corlett claims that giving back this little chunk of land wouldn't actually be good enough or wouldn't be fair reparation for all the injustices that have been done to Native Americans. So he would look at something like the Buffalo Commons proposal as perhaps feasible, but basically an insultingly low amount of reparation. So reparation for Corlett needs to be proportional, that the repayment has to be proportional or equal in significance to the harm done. And given the massivity of the harm that has been done by the US government and arguably other governments, governments like the government of England or Spain, insofar as they've harmed them, they need to make staggeringly large repayments for the staggeringly large injustices that they committed. So Corlett is going to look at proposals like the Buffalo Commons or a small tax, say like 1% of everyone's income, as so low as to be insulting. So just to sum up, Corlett thinks that injustices towards Native Americans justify payment of reparation. And then he goes on to point out that objections from historical complexity, collective responsibility, and social utility are found to be inadequate. So on historical complexity, he says we can know enough about history and injustices done to Native Americans. When it comes to collective responsibility, he says that, yeah, the US government is the same entity that it was 100 or 150 or 200 years ago, and can bear burdens that it acquired way back then, much in the way that it can acquire debts and much in the way that it's secured advantages for some people. And then finally, the social utility objection. Wouldn't things go really bad if we paid reparations? And Corlett's reply there is to say, if it does hurt, that's just too bad. It's what justice requires. So that's our first look at the question of reparations. Next time around, we're going to look at a paper by the philosopher Jeremy Waldron. And we're going to look at Waldron's view that maybe we need to moderate our view of exactly how much reparation is owed, especially for historical injustices committed long ago. So I'll look forward to hearing what you have to say about Corlett's argument about reparations in the discussion forums. And keep working hard. Keep thinking about what you might write for your term paper at the end of the term. And I'll look forward to hearing what you have to say. Okay, so thanks for listening in, and be in touch.